If you ask the internet where the Bible came from, they will probably tell you it was, like, invented in some smoke-filled room in 325 AD.
Right, by a Roman emperor looking to consolidate power.
Exactly. But the real story is, well, it involves laughing saviors, bitter theological insult wars, and these ancient ideas that are so utterly bizarre and yet so resilient that they are actively resurfacing today in, of all places, the halls of quantum physics.
Yeah, the contrast between the tidy gilded book you see in a hotel nightstand and the chaotic, centuries-long battlefield that actually produced it is just staggering. I mean, we are looking at one of the muddiest historical landscapes in human history.
And as a lifelong learner, you listening right now probably appreciate knowing the real mechanisms behind massive cultural institutions. You want the actual data, right? Not the polished PR version.
Exactly.
So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack a really fascinating stack of sources we've gathered. We've got academic papers, ancient historical canon lists, a compelling cultural analysis on African spirituality, and even this highly skeptical modern audio transcript.
And we're using all of that to discover how the 27 books in the New Testament actually came together. Because the stakes underlying these sources are monumental.
Oh, absolutely.
We're basically exploring the core tension of Christian history here. Was this text dropped from the sky? Was it cobbled together by some sinister political conspiracy? Or was it something far more organic and, honestly, a lot more complex?
Okay, let's unpack this. But before we dive into the deep end, I do want to establish a really important ground rule for you listening.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Our sources today contain incredibly intense, conflicting claims. I mean, we have aggressive arguments from early Orthodox Christians, radically different views from ancient Gnostic sects, and pointed critiques from modern secular scholars.
Right.
So we are actively not taking any sides here. Our goal is strictly to impartially report and explore the ideas contained in these original source materials. We just want to let you see the architecture of their arguments.
Yeah, we are operating as historical tour guides, basically.
Yeah.
Just examining the theological combat exactly as it played out in the ancient world.
So let's start by dismantling that internet narrative I mentioned earlier. We actually have an audio transcript in our sources that perfectly captures this punchy modern skepticism.
The one that addresses believers directly.
Yeah, exactly. It literally opens with, "Hey, Christians, you don't follow Jesus, you follow someone's version of Jesus."
Wow.
Yeah, it doesn't hold back. The speaker claims Jesus wrote absolutely nothing down, the authors of the Gospels are totally anonymous, and that centuries later, these councils of men essentially acted as bouncers.
Bouncers.
Like club bouncers, just deciding which books got into the club and which would be burned as heresy to stabilize their own political power.
Well, I mean, that narrative taps into a very natural, very modern suspicion of authority. It frames the formation of the Bible as an executive order rather than, a spiritual consensus.
Right.
And that narrative almost inevitably points to the Council of Nicaea, which was convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine.
The famous story that the philosopher Voltaire popularized, right?
Yes, exactly.
According to Voltaire's version, the bishops at Nicaea put all the known religious texts on an altar, they prayed, and the rejected apocryphal books miraculously just fell off onto the floor.
Right, leaving only the canonical Bible behind on the table.
Which sounds insane.
It does. And Voltaire featured that story in his 18th century philosophical dictionary to openly mock the church. Dan Brown and modern internet commentators subsequently inherited those exact talking points.
But wait, the Phoenix Seminary source actually tracks down where that falling off the altar myth came from, right?
They do, and it is fascinating. It did not originate in 325 AD at Nicaea. The story actually stems from a late 9th century Greek manuscript called the Synodicon Vetus.
The 9th century. That is hundreds of years after Constantine was dead.
A massive chronological gap. And then that specific 9th century manuscript was bought, edited, and published in 1601 by a man named John Pappas. Yeah, that 1601 publication is where the myth really gained traction in Europe, and that's ultimately how it landed on Voltaire's desk.
Okay, so I am struggling to reconcile this popular myth with what the bishops were actually doing in 325 AD.
How so?
Well, if Nicaea wasn't a giant book-sorting convention, Emperor Constantine still spent a fortune gathering over 300 bishops in one place. Like, what was actually on the docket?
Their primary agenda was addressing a crisis called Arianism.
Okay.
This was a massive foundational debate over the very nature of reality and the divine. A church leader named Arius was arguing that Jesus was a created being.
Like an angel or something?
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
The first and greatest creation, but still the creation. But the opposing side argued Jesus was co-eternal, of the exact same substance as God the Father.
Oh, that's a huge difference.
Exactly. And Constantine needed them to resolve this theological civil war to maintain imperial stability. They also needed to figure out a standardized mathematical formula for calculating the date of Easter across the whole empire.
So books weren't even brought up.
The biblical canon simply wasn't on the agenda, because they were arguing from a generally shared set of texts, not arguing about the texts themselves.
Okay, but if there was no central authority at Nicaea forcing people to read Matthew and John, I want to know the mechanism that actually pushed those specific texts to the top of the pile. Something had to drive that universal adoption.
Right, and the scholar Francis Watson provides a brilliant framework for this in his work, The Fourfold Gospel.
What's his take?
He demonstrates that early Christianity was a process of decentralized local reception by everyday readers. To see the mechanics of this, we just have to look at the dry sands of Egypt.
The papyri evidence.
Exactly. Actual physical fragments of early Christian books that survived the centuries. The survival rates of these manuscripts mathematically map out that grassroots adoption.
Yeah, the numbers in the sources are really striking. Archaeologists have uncovered 26 early copies of the Gospel of John and 22 of Matthew.
Which is a lot for antiquity.
Right. And by contrast, non-canonical texts like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter, they only yield about 3 surviving copies each.
And that matters because people in antiquity did not waste expensive papyrus and hundreds of hours of manual labor copying texts they didn't deeply value. The physical evidence shows us what the average Christian community was actually utilizing in their weekly gatherings.
You know, I noticed a strange linguistic detail in the sources regarding how these texts were categorized.
Oh, about the word gospel.
Yeah. Originally, the Apostle Paul used the word gospel purely to describe the spoken message he was preaching. He was talking about an oral announcement, not a physical book.
That's right.
And out of the 4 canonical texts, only Mark originally used the word gospel to describe his written scroll. Matthew and John just called their works books, and Luke called his a narrative.
Yeah, for decades, the gospel was strictly an oral proclamation. But as the original generation of apostles began to die out, there was this pressing need to preserve that testimony in a fixed format.
Make sure the story doesn't change.
Precisely. Mark boldly titled his written work, The Beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, essentially claiming that his physical scroll contained the definitive oral message.
And it just caught on.
Yes. The readers, the early Christian communities themselves, began applying Mark's specific term to all 4 of these highly circulated texts to signify they were distinct angles of the exact same message.
So the early church was essentially crowdsourcing its spiritual library. It kind of reminds me of a modern community-curated playlist.
What do you mean?
Well, like, a streaming platform doesn't force a song to go viral, right? The algorithm simply recognizes which tracks millions of people are already listening to on repeat, and then it formally labels them the top hits.
Ah, I see.
The institutional church was just formally recognizing the spiritual tracks that had already achieved massive organic reach.
That's a great analogy.
Huh.
And around 180 CE, a prominent bishop named Irenaeus actually stepped in to formalize that organic reach.
What did he do?
He championed the idea that there should be exactly 4 gospels, no more, no less. He even justified it using natural architecture.
Natural architecture. Like buildings.
More like the natural world. He argued that just as there are 4 zones of the world and 4 principal winds, there must be 4 pillars of the church.
That's very poetic.
Right. But practically, he championed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John precisely because those specific texts had already grown the deepest, widest root systems across the entire Mediterranean.
But the sources also make it incredibly clear that this grassroots process was not entirely peaceful.
No, not at all.
There was intense, hostile friction between different ideological camps. And this leads right into a major modern academic debate over the very concept of orthodoxy.
What's fascinating here is how modern scholarship attempts to reinterpret that historical hostility. In the book, The Heresy of Orthodoxy, we encounter the Bauer-Ehrman thesis.
Which is a huge deal in biblical studies today.
Massive. It's an incredibly influential academic theory proposed by the German scholar Walter Bauer in 1934, and it's widely popularized today by historians like Bart Ehrman.
So Bauer and Ehrman basically argue that early Christianity possessed absolutely no unified doctrinal core.
Right.
In their view, there was no original, pristine orthodoxy handed down by the apostles. Instead, the first and second centuries were just this chaotic marketplace of wildly diverse Christianities.
Yes. You had groups like the Marcionites who completely rejected the God of the Old Testament. They wanted a Bible consisting only of a heavily edited version of Luke and some of Paul's letters.
Wow. So under the Bauer-Ehrman framework, the only reason we have the traditional Orthodox version today is because the specific faction based in Rome eventually accumulated the most financial and political capital.
They essentially won the turf war.
Right. They stamped their own views as Orthodox and ruthlessly crushed rivals like the Marcionites, burning their texts and erasing their history. The thesis literally asserts that heresy preceded orthodoxy.
Yeah.
The cultural irony of this is fascinating. In our modern, postmodern world, we value diversity of thought so highly that diversity itself has become the new cultural orthodoxy.
That's very true.
And traditional, rigid orthodoxy is frequently treated as the new heresy, just some cynical artifact of ancient power dynamics.
But scholars like Andreas Kustenberger and Michael Kruger actively challenge the Bauer-Ehrman thesis.
What's their counter-argument?
They argue that a rigorous examination of the earliest historical evidence reveals there actually was a unified doctrinal core from the very beginning.
Based on what?
Well, they point out that earliest Christianity was deeply tethered to the Old Testament scriptures and to a very specific set of apostolic teachings about a physical incarnation and resurrection.
So it wasn't just a free-for-all.
Exactly. In their view, the Orthodox leaders weren't just flexing political muscle to crush diversity. They were urgently defending an objective theological inheritance from radical distortion.
You know, to really grasp why the early Orthodox Christians viewed that diversity not as a beautiful tapestry, but as a fatal poison, we have to look directly at the alternative texts.
We need to see what the rivals were actually writing.
Yes. Let's dive into the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter.
Okay, so this text, which was discovered in 1945, hidden in a jar at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, offers a visceral counter-narrative to the traditional Gospels.
The imagery in this document is wild. The Apostle Peter is having a vision of the crucifixion. But instead of a somber, agonizing scene, he sees the living Jesus standing and floating above the cross.
Right.
And he is joyful. He is literally laughing out loud at the ignorance of the people below him, while a physical substitute is the one actually suffering and dying on the wood.
It sounds bizarre, but to understand why Jesus is laughing in this text, we have to unpack the underlying machinery of Gnosticism.
Okay, let's do it.
The Gnostics operated on a profoundly dualistic worldview. They believed the material world, our physical universe, the dirt, our biological bodies, was an inherently evil, corrupt prison.
The material world itself is evil.
Completely. And furthermore, they believed this physical prison was not created by the ultimate supreme God, but by a flawed, malevolent, lower-tier deity they often called the demiurge, or Yaldabaoth.
Right. So if physical matter is a disgusting prison, then the ultimate pure divine Christ couldn't possibly be subjected to it. He couldn't inhabit a real digestive system or experience actual biological pain.
And this leads to a theological concept called docetism, the idea that Christ only appeared to have a physical body. It was basically an optical illusion.
Wow.
Because the divine spirit is utterly disconnected from matter, it could not suffer on a piece of wood. Therefore, the Orthodox concept of salvation, the idea of a physical blood sacrifice on a cross to atone for human sin, was logically absurd to the Gnostics.
So if it's not about the cross, what is salvation to them?
Salvation wasn't about the cross. Salvation was about attaining gnosis.
And gnosis translates roughly to, like, secret esoteric knowledge, right?
Yeah. Yes. Knowledge that awakens the hidden divine spark trapped inside the human soul. Once an individual attains this secret knowledge, their internal spark is awakened, allowing them to finally escape the physical prison of the demiurge and return to the purely spiritual realm.
And the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter is incredibly aggressive about this. The text openly mocks proto-Orthodox Christians, the ones who believe Jesus actually suffered a physical death.
Oh, they don't hold back.
Not at all. It calls them blind and deaf. The text refers to Orthodox bishops and deacons as dry canals who are proudly worshiping a dead man, claiming they are trapped by the father of their error.
The term dry canals is a devastating theological insult.
Really? Why?
Well, a canal is designed to carry life-giving water, but a dry one is just an empty, useless trench. The Gnostics were accusing the Orthodox institutional leaders of possessing rigid structural authority, but absolutely zero actual spiritual vitality.
Ouch. Yeah, the sheer hostility of calling someone a dry canal forced Orthodox leaders into a defensive posture. They realized unspoken agreements and organic crowdsourcing weren't enough anymore.
Right, things had escalated.
Facing these Gnostic interpretations that completely severed Christianity from its physical and Jewish roots, the Orthodox Church realized they had to aggressively define the perimeter of their faith.
And we see that perimeter taking shape in the rapid-fire history of the canon lists. It was an evolving, highly analytical effort to categorize writings.
How did they organize it?
Well, if we look at the historian Eusebius in the early 300s, he didn't just operate with a simple binary of in or out. He utilized four distinct categories to organize the immense amount of literature circulating in the empire.
Right. Category 1 was universally accepted. These were the undisputed heavyweights, like the four Gospels and Paul's letters.
Yes.
But Category 2 was disputed. And this category is fascinating to me because it includes books we take for granted today, like Revelation, Hebrews, and 2 Peter. These texts were hotly debated for hundreds of years. The wild, apocalyptic imagery of Revelation, for instance, made many early church leaders highly suspicious of its origin.
Yeah, it wasn't a sure thing at all. And then Category 3 was commended reading. These were books like the Didache or the Shepherd of Hermas.
Which are great books, but not Bible level.
Right. The church considered them highly beneficial, morally upright texts for beginners, but they lacked the apostolic authority to be considered divinely inspired scripture.
Got it.
And finally, Category 4, rejected forgeries. This is where Eusebius placed the Gnostic texts, warning they were doctrinally mutated.
So the climax of this boundary drawing process arrives with Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria. In the year 367 CE, he writes his famous 39th Festal Letter.
Usually, a festal letter was just an annual administrative memo sent to the Egyptian churches to announce the official date of Easter.
Just housekeeping.
Yeah, but Athanasius leverages this specific letter to build an impenetrable wall against Gnosticism.
And in it, Athanasius explicitly lists the exact 27 books of the New Testament that we recognize today. He declares them the exclusive springs of salvation, stating that in these books alone, the doctrine of piety is proclaimed.
And he didn't leave any wiggle room.
None. He instructs his churches to let no one add to them or take away from them, and he explicitly downgrades the apocryphal texts as fabrications designed by heretics to deceive the simple-minded.
Which is a huge moment.
Huge! And Athanasius had to write this letter over 40 years after the Council of Nicaea. This definitively proves the debate wasn't settled in 325 AD. It was a rigorous, messy, centuries-long struggle over identity and truth.
Yes, and Athanasius' list was eventually ratified by subsequent regional councils, and the Orthodox canon officially won the historical battle, dominating Western civilization for the next millennium and a half.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The Orthodox Church may have won the institutional battle, but according to our sources, Gnosticism never actually died.
It just went dormant.
Right. An incredibly thought-provoking article from the Akka Times suggests that these ancient banned Gnostic concepts are actively resurfacing today in modern science, psychology, and global spirituality.
The structural parallels are remarkable. Let's look at modern cosmology, for example.
Okay.
The core Gnostic belief is that the material world is inherently flawed, decaying, and destined for ultimate destruction. This maps almost perfectly onto the scientific reality of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, modern astrophysics contemplates the eventual heat death of the universe, or the Big Rip, where the cosmos simply tears itself apart as all energy dissipates into cold nothingness. The physical universe is objectively a temporary decaying construct, just exactly as the Gnostics claimed.
And the connection to quantum mechanics is even more mind-bending to me. In physics, you have the concept of quantum superposition, the idea that a particle exists in multiple possible states simultaneously until it is measured or observed.
The observer effect.
Right. So the physical world we experience is just the localized, collapsed version of a much stranger, underlying mathematical reality. This mirrors the exact Gnostic intuition that there is a hidden, truer reality completely obscured by our crude physical senses.
The physicist David Bohm proposed a concept called the implicate order to explain this.
How does that work?
Imagine taking a drop of ink and placing it into a cylinder filled with clear glycerin. If you slowly turn a crank, the ink drop smears out, stretching into a gray haze until it seems to completely disappear into the fluid.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But if you reverse the crank, the ink gathers itself back together into a perfectly formed, distinct drop.
Because the order was always there, it was just hidden beneath the surface.
Precisely, it isn't folded. Bohm argued that the physical world we see and touch is the explicate order, the smeared ink. But it unfolds from a deeper, perfectly organized hidden reality, the implicate order.
That's fascinating.
It's a profoundly modern secular physics framework that functions almost identically to the Gnostic quest to look past the illusion of the physical shell and find the hidden divine perfection underneath.
We also see this in Carl Jung's psychological framework. He popularized the concept of the collective unconscious and universal archetypes hidden deep within the human psyche.
Right. Jung essentially psychologized the Gnostic divine spark, transforming the search for esoteric spiritual knowledge into the internal quest for psychological integration and self-discovery.
And the Akka Times article brilliantly expands this by examining African spirituality. They analyze the concept of the chi in Igbo culture.
Yes.
The chi is a personal, internal divine force that guides the individual. And what is striking is how an Igbo person interacts with their chi. You don't go through a hierarchical priest to access it.
No intermediary.
Exactly. You establish a personal shrine and internal dialogue. It is a direct, unmediated connection to the divine that bypasses institutional gatekeepers entirely.
It perfectly mirrors the Gnostic idea of the internal divine spark. And when we observe African independent churches today, we see a fascinating syncretism.
How do they blend it?
They blend traditional Christianity with this massive emphasis on personal, mystical revelation, prophetic utterance, and direct spiritual experience, often prioritizing that internal experience over rigid, Western ecclesiastical hierarchies.
It really suggests that the Gnostic impulse, this deep human desire for unmediated personal spiritual knowledge, combined with a profound suspicion of corrupt material power structures, is a universal human intuition.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just some quirky second-century Egyptian cult. It is a permanent fixture of human psychology that just keeps changing its vocabulary, from theology to quantum physics.
The human desire to escape the confines of physical reality and institutional authority is clearly inextinguishable.
So to synthesize this massive journey, we started by debunking the internet myth of a smoke-filled room at Nicaea. We saw how the four Gospels organically rose to the top of the papyrus pile through centuries of crowdsourced copying. We witnessed the bitter, insult-throwing rivalry between the proto-Orthodox Christians defending a physical incarnation and the Gnostics worshiping a laughing, immaterial savior.
And that hostility forced leaders like Athanasius to finally draw hard boundaries around the 27-book New Testament.
Exactly. Realizing how messy, human, and hard-fought this history was makes the survival of these texts infinitely more fascinating than the myth of a magical book dropping from the sky.
It really is a testament to the endurance of these ideas. But, I want to leave you with one final, deeply ironic twist from the sources to mull over on your own.
Okay, lay it on us.
Despite the Orthodox Church's relentless, centuries-long campaign to wipe out Gnosticism and defend the goodness of physical creation, elements of Gnosticism were accidentally smuggled into the very foundations of the Church by its greatest defenders.
Wait, sorry, I shouldn't be surprised at this point, but how did the defenders of orthodoxy manage to smuggle in the very ideas they were fighting?
Through philosophical absorption. Early Church fathers like Origen, attempting to make Christianity intellectually rigorous, actually proposed the idea that human souls existed in a purely spiritual realm before they fell and were embodied in physical flesh.
Oh, wow. That sounds very Gnostic.
It does. And St. Augustine, who is arguably the single most influential theologian in Western Christian history, he actually spent nearly a decade as a Manichaean before his conversion.
What's Manichaeism?
Manichaeism was a deeply dualistic Gnostic adjacent sect. And even after Augustine became a champion of Orthodox Christianity, he carried forward deep, lingering anxieties about human sexuality, the physical body, and the soul's entrapment in material sin.
That completely changes the picture. So the next time you picture that neatly printed, perfectly bound book, and you think about the strict lines drawn between heresy and orthodoxy, you have to ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. Did the Orthodox victors actually manage to completely purge the Gnostic impulse? Or did they just absorb its DNA into their own theology, rename it, and bind it into the very pages they fought so hard to protect?